Welcome to the Leadership School podcast. I'm your host, leadership and self-care coach, Kyla Kofer. Here at the Leadership School, you'll hear leaders from around the world sharing their stories and expertise on how to lead with balance and integrity. Our goal? Teach you how to be an extraordinary leader. Welcome back, everybody, to the Leadership School podcast. I'm here today with Heather Hansen. Very excited about introducing you to her. We are going to talk about her work around language and what to do when we are working with people who sound different than we do. We get into a lot of details about this and why this is important for leadership roles, because we are in a global remote economy where we are going to be working with throughout our lives people from all over the world, people who sound different than us, who look different than us, who act different than us. How do you work towards a common goal together when sometimes it feels like I might not know exactly what the other person is saying? But is that really true? We're going to find out here in this conversation. Tune in to meet Heather Hansen and hear all about learning to interact with different accents, different languages, different cultures here on the Leadership School podcast. Heather, thank you so much for coming to the Leadership School podcast. We've been talking for some time and been really excited to have you on the podcast. I know you're just coming off of an ear infection and not feeling that great. So even though you're there, thank you so much for taking the time to join me it's morning for you. So thank you for being here.
Yeah. Oh, well, I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me. And ear infection and all. Hopefully I can make it through.
Oh my gosh, you're a champion. Why don't you just jump in and tell us a little bit about yourself so that our audience can hear it directly from you, what you do, your expertise. You've got your book behind you. You've got a TED Talk. I mean, you've got all cool things happening. So let's hear it from you. What are you all about, Heather?
Oh, thanks. Yeah, there is a lot happening, but I am all about global communication. That is at the core of everything that I do. And I've lived a very global life. I'm originally from California. And a month after graduating from university, I left on the 4th of July, my own Independence Day, and I moved to Denmark. And I lived there for 4 years, then came to Asia, lived in Singapore for 8, went back to Denmark, another 4, then I'm back again for another 4 in Singapore. So my life has been very global, living in North America, Europe, Asia, working with individuals to help them feel confident communicating in English, typically when it isn't their first language. Because what I learned living in Denmark especially was that when I spoke in Danish, I was a very different person. I didn't have the same confidence. I couldn't raise my hand as quickly in the meeting. I couldn't jump into the conversation. And I felt like I wasn't given the same respect and that I wasn't viewed in the same way. And I thought, for me, it's easy. I can always switch back to English and get my power back. But what about all these people in the world? What about Indonesian speakers or Mandarin speakers or even Italian speakers? You know, not everyone in the world knows those languages and they're forced to operate in English. And that really opened my eyes to the challenges that they face. And it really determined the course of my career. So that's what I've dedicated my life to for the last 15 years. I started a company here in Singapore, Global Speech Academy, where I train top level professionals in showing up and speaking up, inspiring action with confidence in their global teams.
Using language, using English.
Yeah, in the English medium, because that is our global business language. And who knows, maybe decades from now that will change. But for the foreseeable future, it looks like English is here to stay. So it's helping them to operate in this English speaking world.
And you have a book, and then you also have a TED Talk. And that is what connected us, was your TED Talk, because I was so inspired by it. So maybe you could talk about both of those things real quick. And then I have a lot of questions for you.
Yeah. Well, the TEDx, I did my TEDx in Odense, Denmark in 2018. And it's called 2 Billion Voices, How to Speak Bad English Perfectly. And it came about from my frustration and people coming to me saying, my English is so bad, and fix me. Or HR people sending their top leaders saying, fix them, we can't understand them, nobody can understand them. And my argument is that there is no good or bad. There is no good or bad when it comes to language. If we are communicating, if you can make yourself understood, people are understanding you, you are understanding others, then communication is successful. And that should be our goal and guiding light, not trying to emulate some kind of perfect standard, which is actually quite arbitrary and is something that the dominant, powerful group has decided to write down in a grammar book. And so that's behind my philosophy and everything that I do in my work is that all varieties of English are equal, that as long as we're communicating, that is what's most important. And then the book, Unmuted, which came out earlier this year, that is, I feel like it brings together all of the different areas of my work into one book. And there's probably 5 more books inside of that book. So it brings together the cross-cultural communication element and conscious communication. It brings forward basic skill sets and presentation skills and articulation, listening skills, how to build confidence. And then it also touches on how to build strong interpersonal skills, human relationships in the workplace to feel more connected with our teams so that we can be more innovative, so that we're listening and we're inclusive in the workplace in a global context. So Unmuted is all about inspiring people to show up in the world and share their bright ideas because I don't think we're hearing them right now. And we need everyone to come forward and speak up and take their place at the table.
So there is a lot here to talk about, and I hope we can get a good chunk of it here in just our short conversation because as you're talking, I'm just feeling so excited because this is so important. And we have been in like a global economy for a very, very long time now. And when you think about remote work, how we have people working from all over the globe, I personally have people from 3 different countries on my team, and sometimes that communication is really hard. And I think that it's really easy, and you alluded to this a minute ago, to make judgments about somebody based on their accent or based on the way that they say a word. And that can really actually end up harming us. And so maybe you can talk a little bit about bad English and how do we communicate with people who aren't speaking the accent that we understand, because they might say the words we understand but not a sound that we understand, and there's often like conversations where slang that can be confusing. And when you're approaching all those things in a global conversation and you've got teams from all over the world, or you've got a big company that's got branches in different areas, you've got to work with people. And I think people who were born in the United States whose language is first English and it's really can be culturally like easy to look at someone and go, "Oh, they're stupid because they don't speak my language." And not that we all believe that, but sometimes I think we might have that first thought, and it could be shameful to admit and think about, but we might have that, "Oh, they don't know because they're not that smart." And then you find out they've got like 7 degrees and speak 14 languages, and you're like, "Oh my gosh, I'm the idiot here." But you still in your mind are like, "Well, they really don't know." So how do we work
Mm.
with that? I guess that's the meat of what I want to talk about today is really how do we work through that and how do we like
Ooh,
be excited about talking
yeah.
with other people who don't sound like we sound.
Ooh, well, let's dig into it then. There's a
Yeah,
lot in there to unpack,
I know.
actually. Just in that question, there's a lot to unpack. First of all, recognizing the fact that this isn't even necessarily a native, non native issue. So if we look at the United States and I just throw out things like, oh, think of someone who speaks with a Southern accent. What about a New York accent? What about a Boston accent? What about New Jersey? What about Hollywood? The Valley Girl? What about Black English? What about Hispanic English? If I just throw out multiple varieties of natively spoken varieties in the United States, immediately in your mind, I'm sure, whether you like it or not, and there's nothing wrong with you because of it, but stereotypes pop into your head. And you immediately think of the oh so friendly, hospitable, sweet Southern belle with that gorgeous Southern drawl who isn't so bright, but oh, she's so sweet, right? And I know that woman. That's a friend of mine from Alabama who went to New York to work on Wall Street and every day was called Pollyanna by her colleagues, was not taken seriously, got no respect, and was basically driven out of the country. She moved to the UK and became a professional speaker. So this is happening even within our own varieties of English within the United States. It happens in Canada with Quebec and French. And I mean, this happens everywhere in every language within the language itself due to regional differences, socioeconomic differences, education differences. And we have ideas in our minds of how we rank these different accents. Then when we pull in global accents, that just makes it even more complicated.
What is making us have that thought anyways? I mean, where is that coming from?
Mm,
Because it's like something we might do naturally, and then when we realize we did it, we're like, "That's not who I am. Why am I thinking that way?" Like, I don't think that about that person, but why are we responding that way? Is it because of television and movies, entertainment? Like, what is making us think that?
it's a big part of it. It's what we grow up listening to, what we grow up hearing, and how those specific voices are designed in our lives. So think all the way back to cartoons you watched as a child, Disney films. Every villain in every Disney film has an accent, some kind of accented variety. Maybe it's a native sounding variety. Maybe it's even Pixar. Think of that show Cars. This just popped in my mind. But there's that truck that has this real southern, a lot of those cars, the real dumb one has this southern drawl. And so it's not even a bad guy. He's actually one of the favorite characters in the film in Cars, but he has this southern drawl and he's kind of the dopey,
Mater.
slow
Yeah.
talking. Yo, you know the name. Good for you.
I
Okay.
do. We have a book. We have a book, and the book has
Okay.
got Southern accent, like the way it's written. I have to read it in a Southern accent.
Oh, see, and this is exactly what I mean. Wow, I didn't realize that. That makes this example even more perfect because you're actually being told to read it a certain way. That accent is a major part of that character's personality, and it is signaling to us this general stereotype of dopey, slow thinking, but so kind hearted, bless your heart kind of Southern hospitality. And we see this everywhere. I grew up with Indiana Jones films. All the bad guys were German and Russian. This was all, all during the Cold War up to the Berlin Wall falling and into the 90s. And it was all German and Russian. Those were the bad guys. Then the geopolitical landscape changes. We have a lot of Arabs coming into film as our bad guys and the terrorists and the global threat. So you can see what happens. And as Hollywood drives this, we just consume it. And then we have people growing up with The Simpsons and the character Apu, who defined what it meant to be a immigrant and shopkeeper and had an Indian accent, which was not voiced by an Indian individual, by the way. It's voiced by a white man making up what he believes is an Indian sounding dialect, which was a complete stereotype. And no one actually sounds like that. So we grow up hearing this. And what's scary is we have judgments about it at a very young age. And the research I was reading before was saying that at around age 5, we can hear the differences. Well, we can hear and we know the differences from birth. We know our mother's voice. We know the dialect and accent our mother has. And we know that there are other languages and other sound sets that don't belong. We know that from birth. By age 5, we're distinguishing, my accent versus yours. And by age 9, we were distinguishing mine is good or bad. But now, just in the last week or so, I read of a new research study that put that all the way down at age 5 as well.
Wow.
That at age 5, some kids were able to tell that, oh, my Southern accent is not good and the Northern accent is smart. Those are the smart people. They sound smarter than me. And they were already able to identify that. And they're learning that simply through books like Cars that are making a mockery of that type of accent. And it's part of our culture. It's the way we categorize people. And it is quite dangerous. It's something that I believe is the last acceptable form of discrimination in our society. We aren't talking about it. We would never talk like this about someone's race or ethnicity, but we can easily do it with accent, which is so closely tied to race and ethnicity that it's quite scary. So there's still no problem saying, oh, his accent's so heavy and oh, it sounds so foreign and oh, so hard to understand. That's acceptable to say for some reason.
Well, and sometimes it is hard to understand, but that
Yeah.
doesn't mean there's something bad about it. It just, and they might be having a hard time understanding us too. So you have to realize that when we're having a conversation with someone, I really love closed captions because that can help me with the language. Like if I might not understand a word, sometimes that just helps in general. Like if someone speaks more quietly or just skipped ahead for something, like hearing and seeing, having the visual helps me a lot. But so I guess the next thing in my mind is what do we do in this situation when we truly can't understand somebody? It sounds like we have a lot of things we have to think through. First, we have to go, just because I can't understand them doesn't mean that they're not smart, that they can't contribute, that they don't know more than I do. So acknowledging that in
And
us.
we need to go even a step back
Okay.
because what they found in a number of studies is that you're actually understanding more than you think. And due to the accent bias, you're ignoring that understanding. So because it's difficult for you, you are just turning off and not listening. They did a study where they actually had people transcribe what they were listening to, and they transcribed it perfectly and then passed it back and said, I can't understand a word he's saying. He's so difficult to understand. I can't understand a word of it. Yet they transcribed it perfectly. And this is what is actually happening. This is the power of accent bias. You go into a conference, you see someone on stage, they have an accent that you consider heavy, that maybe triggers some underlying frustration in you because you spoke to someone who sounded like that in a call center once and you're incredibly frustrated by it and you don't like listening to that accent
And you don't even
and
realize that's happening in your mind.
you don't even realize and you decide, ugh, I can't stand listening to him. I hate his English. He's totally uneducated anyway. It's obvious. You turn off and you say, I just can't understand him. Well, in reality, you can understand probably much, much more than you are thinking you can. And you simply don't want to. You don't want to make that effort. So, first step is check in with yourself. Can you understand? Are you making an effort? Are you actually understanding? It just doesn't sound the way you would like it to sound because chances are you understand a lot more than you think. You do understand a lot. So, that is actually the first step. Be really honest with yourself. How much do you understand? Because you're understanding more than you think when you're focused on it.
Well, that makes me think about like all my international travels. I've learned Spanish as a second language. And the way that I learned it, when you're around people who speak a different language, you literally don't understand the words because you don't know them. Yet so many times I could still participate in a conversation
Yes.
because I could understand the context or what was happening. So, one of the ways I learned Spanish through a lot of different methods, I studied it, classes, people, friends, and that. But one way that I learned was by watching telenovelas, which is the Spanish
Yeah.
version of a soap opera. And we would watch it. I'd watch it with all my friends. So, we would be speaking about it in Spanish, watching the show, and then we would watch it with subtitles, like I mentioned before. And even if I didn't understand what they were saying, I always knew what was going on in the show because you can tell by like the interactions. Oh, she's in love with him. She cheated on him. And you know
Yeah.
what's going on. And so, just in my own personal experiences, I've seen how this is so true in that particular example. And anytime I've traveled abroad, another story, I remember being in a cab in China and I had forgotten my camera and I spoke two words of Chinese, hao, which means good, and bu hao, which means not good or bad. And I just kept, we were in the cab. He was taking me to the airport and I'd forgotten my camera. And I just said, bu hao, bu hao, bu hao, bu hao. And he figured out to turn around, take me back to my place, wait for me until I got my camera and came back. And we figured this all out with like
Wow.
no words. So we can understand. I mean, that's just a couple stories that I've had personally.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
if we stop and think about them, I mean, I know you're right, but I've seen that how we do understand each other's language when we make an effort and
Yeah,
when we
because the difference there was your motivation, right? You wanted to communicate. You needed to communicate, and therefore you made that effort, and then nothing gets in your way. But the problem is when someone comes into our world and we aren't interested in making the effort. We're tired. It's the middle of our workday. We don't want to have to focus harder. We don't want to have to listen. We don't want to have to change. You're in my world. You need to speak like me. And that motivation isn't there because we're going about our daily life and we don't care whether that communication happens or not. We're putting the responsibility on the other person to communicate in a way that we can easily understand. And therefore, we decide, not worth my effort. I can't understand you. You're too hard.
that's a
Yeah,
lot of
it's a lot.
responsibility to put on somebody because not only are they responsible for getting to know you, communicating their thing across, but also they're managing your emotions and your
Yes.
feelings and your
Yeah.
education level. Like that's not okay. That's not right.
Yeah. But for those of us, who maybe have never been abroad, have never learned a language, have never been in that situation, a lot of people simply don't understand how difficult that is. And it's not even on their radar. They don't even think about it. They don't realize it. Maybe for some people listening right now, it's the first time they've ever considered any of this before. And I hope there are people like that listening, because once you do realize this is happening and what's going on, you see it everywhere. And it is absolutely everywhere around you. And you just can't believe it when you start noticing it.
Wow. Yeah. So I think we got distracted because I like
Yes,
to
we
tell
did. I took
stories.
us backwards. I'm
I did
sorry. I
too.
took us
No, no,
backwards
no,
too.
no. I'm so glad you did. So where do we go from here?
All right. So let's say that you've checked in with yourself. You realize you do understand most of what's happening here, but you're still having some difficulty. I think it's really typical that we say, "Oh, sorry, I can't understand you," or "Your accent's too heavy," or "Oh, can you repeat that?" Or we start getting really embarrassed, like, "Oh my gosh, I can't understand," and I'm just not going to say anything because I feel so bad saying I don't understand. And we see both of these things happening in global settings. And even I'm sure you've had this kind of situation in your team. I've worked with a lot of very international people too, where sometimes I'm thinking, oh gosh, I just feel bad even saying I don't understand because I really should understand this right now. So, how do we handle those situations? And I think it's about just being very honest. Try not to put the blame on the other person and take responsibility for the communication as well. So, what I try to say is, I'm so sorry. I'm not very familiar with your accent. Maybe I haven't spoken to a lot of French speakers before, or I haven't spoken to people from that part of India, because even in India, there are many, I mean, hundreds of different varieties of ways that they speak. And I might just say, I'm just not very familiar and I just need to listen to you speak more. And I know it's going to get easier, but could you just slow down for me a little bit here in the beginning? Or could you rephrase what you just said? A lot of times they say, could you repeat that? Could you repeat that? If you ask them to repeat it and you haven't understood it 2 or 3 times, repeating it again is not going to help. You're still not going to understand it. You need to ask them to rephrase it. Can you please rephrase that or say it in a different way? Because they can keep saying the same words. You're not going to get it. I guarantee
Well,
it. You're not.
I mean, think about any relationship, any type of communication that you have with
Yes,
anybody. If
true.
they've said it
True.
3 times, you're like, I don't get it. Who was I talking to recently? And I was watching a master class. Have you heard of this master class?
Yeah,
It
yeah,
was
yeah.
fantastic. I was watching one on negotiation, and he said,
Probably Chris Voss, I think, is that
yes, it
one.
was
Yeah.
Chris Voss. It was Chris Voss. It's
Uh-huh.
fantastic. But he was saying to do mirroring or to pause and to just ask what they're saying, and then they'll say further. So the example was for him was in English, he was trying to communicate with his son to grab the notebooks. And his son kept saying, "What notebooks?" And he kept saying, "The notebooks." And his son was like, "What notebooks? The notebooks." And so then his son just went, "The notebooks?" And then he replied, "Oh, yeah, the binder's over there." And then they understood each
Interesting.
other. But that can be hard if you don't understand the actual word that they're saying. But that might be a way too. I just was thinking about that because I watched it literally this week to go, if I'm not understanding it, but to remember too that it happens in English. It happens with every relationship. So
Yes.
I think we forget that because it's our own language. And then we're like, oh, it's only happening when I talk to that person, which is not
Right.
actually true.
And that's not true. It's happening to us all the time. We're having misunderstandings all the time, just in our own accents, even without the accent issues. So, yeah, you're absolutely right.
Hey, thanks so much for listening. Since you've listened this far, it tells me you're really enjoying the content. And I'm so, so grateful. I work really hard to bring you some awesome resources to help really enhance your leadership game. If you're liking this, can you pause really quickly? Make sure you're subscribed, but then also share with one person or more people who you think could really benefit from the content. My goal is to really bring this into some of the top podcasts on leadership in the world. And you can help get there and help us grow by sharing this with everyone you know. Thank you so much. I'm glad you're enjoying the episode. So, what are some other ways that we can? I mean, I guess we own it. We try maybe ask again. Ask, can you say that in another way? What are some other ways we can approach this global communication? I think the goal here is how can we approach conversations with a speaker of a different language than our native language or different accent and assume the best for them. Assume that this conversation is going to go well. Like, what are some ways that we can really not just show up for that, but like make that the best conversation happen?
Oh, I love that question. I love the way you phrased that, because that's how we should be entering every conversation with someone global or someone local. It doesn't matter. We should be entering every conversation wanting the best outcome, wanting to create understanding, wanting to create some kind of union of thought, right? We're negotiating meaning in every conversation. that's what I think is also important to remember. Everyone is individual. They're beyond all of our stereotypes about language and culture and people in general. Every conversation you have is unique, and the way that you interact with that individual is unique. And it's about knowing that when you walk into the conversation, giving them the benefit of the doubt, assuming the best of the person, overcoming any bias that you have. We touched on it, but it is important that you're aware of the biases you have. You know, when I was made aware of all of this, I started thinking about, yeah, what did I grow up with? What influences were given to me? What was I told? What shows did I watch? Where were the bad guys from? Why was I taught that? What was the geopolitical landscape of my youth? What formed these stereotypes in my mind and why? And there are many, many cultural things that are given to us that are not ours, that you end up learning when you move abroad, when you're faced with difference, when you are suddenly, in a restaurant and face some situation that you would never see at home. That's what's great about travel and what opens your mind. But now, as we started this conversation, what you said is absolutely true with remote work. The world is coming to you. So it doesn't matter. Maybe you've never left. You're going to be faced with these differences in values, differences in mentalities and perspectives of the world, whether you leave your living room or not. So it's really important that you've done some work to think about, what has my culture taught me? What are the biases I have, so that you can set them aside when you go into conversations with people who are different. So that when you speak to someone with an Indian accent, you don't immediately assume there's some uneducated person from a call center in India. That's not who you're talking to. You're speaking to your colleague who has probably more degrees than you, definitely speaks more languages than you, and has more world experience than you will ever have.
Anytime I speak to someone from India here, I automatically assume that they have like 3 PhDs or they're a
Yep.
doctor, or I'm like
Yeah.
always
Yeah.
intimidated. I'm like, this person knows so much more than I do every single time.
Yeah, and very often they do. So stereotypes that happen for a reason. And it's good that, you've moved from the, oh, Indian accent means call center to Indian accent means doctor with multiple degrees,
Yeah.
because it's good that stereotype is shifted in your world, right?
Yeah.
But it's still, though, a stereotype. So we have to make sure that we're in touch with what are the biases, stereotypes we hold, not judge ourselves for them. They've been given to us. It's something we know, as long as you're aware that you have them, and you can start working towards overcoming them. But this is difficult because a lot of these, we are not aware of them, and they're operating in the background. And we have to be really honest with ourselves, because no one likes to think that they are in any way discriminatory towards others. We like to think we're good people, and we are good people, but this is how culture works. And we need to be aware of that.
Well, I
Yeah.
think the things too, I'm hearing from you are like some of those you're talking about, like our unconscious biases, the things that are kind of in our subconscious back of our minds, like somewhere buried deep. And I think some of that's like that energy and that spirit that we carry with us. So like when someone says something and you just kind of give them a look, or you're just like, ugh, you don't realize you might be doing that. But people feel that. Like you can feel when someone enters a room, if they bring joy with them, if they bring sorrow, if they bring anger, you can feel that when someone enters a room. And so we can give that out, and we sometimes do it based on the quick judgments that we have made about somebody. And it could be dependent on what they deliver to us, right? So if we're in a doctor's office with a native Indian speaker and they deliver us bad news, like we got to be careful how we carry that. Like, are we judging the news? Are we judging the person? Are we like, there's just a lot of things that can go on in here. And so, one thing I think is important to address is how can we create a sense of psychological safety and building confidence, because especially if we're in leadership roles and here we are leading global teams, how can we make sure that when someone shows up in our space, on our team, wherever that is, that they feel safe to speak up, that they feel confident in what they say, no matter how it comes across, that they get a place at the table, a place in the room, that their opinions are valid and that they matter, and that we're not unconsciously sending over these, well, you're less important because I can't understand you.
That's so important. And this is really what's happening day in, day out in global settings, in boardrooms, in meeting rooms all over the world. And it is really important as a leader to lay the groundwork and foundation to ensure everyone feels comfortable and confident at the table. Sadal Neely is a Harvard Business School professor who's done some interesting work around language, specifically in a Japanese company called Rakuten, which is like the Amazon of Japan. And many years ago now, the time flies, but at least a decade ago, the CEO, Mikitani, came in one day and said, "From tomorrow, our company speaks English." And this is in Tokyo. And in front of a bunch of Japanese, he said, "I don't care if we're sitting in Japan. I don't care if we're all Japanese. We speak English from tomorrow." And sure enough, they came in the next day and all the signs in the canteen were turned to English. People were kind of panicking because many of them did not have English language skills at that time. He said, "You have 3 years. We will support you. We'll give you lessons. If you're not at this level of language in 3 years, you're out." And that was how it went from that day forward. And he credits this Englishnization process to the company's global expansion, and they have globally expanded. But in Sadal Neely's work with that company, she came up with rules of engagement for meetings. And what she talked about there, because what she saw was interesting, there were Americans and Japanese and everybody using English, but there were different levels of fluency in that language and confidence in the language. And so there are always people at the table who will be more dominant, maybe because of personality, but in this case specifically, the language helped a lot. So the people who were dominant, very fluent in the language, they have to dial down the dominance. And then the people who are maybe not as confident, they also have to take some responsibility and dial up their engagement. So they can't just play victim and be like, "Oh, it's so hard. I can't." And "Oh, they're so dominant." They also need to make the effort. And I know it's incredibly hard because I have been there, speaking a foreign language and trying to communicate and feeling self conscious, but you have to make the effort. So they have to dial up engagement. But then the most important is the leader's role. The person in the leadership position is there to balance for inclusion. And that is their main role in the meeting, balance for inclusion. So they are the ones that are watching and listening and saying, "Okay, John, we've heard quite a bit from you. Let's hear from Angie. We haven't heard her speak yet. Angie, please let us know what you're thinking."
So their job is just the listening and giving that feedback.
Yeah, the listening and balancing and inviting
Wow.
people into the conversation. So there's a lot to be said for inviting people in, actually saying by name, "Would you like to add something?" Because very often, just because someone is quiet in the meeting, it does not mean they don't have something to say. This is true in our
Oh,
normal
yeah.
conversations with introverts, extroverts. I mean, there's always someone sitting there who is thinking something, but not saying it. And we need to invite them in. And sometimes simply that invitation is enough, and then they say, "Oh, actually, yes," and then give us their opinion. So that's really important that we're inviting people into the conversation. Also, laying the foundation for the fact that we aren't going to have any kind of microaggressions around accent and language, that we don't make fun of people's accents, we don't laugh at pronunciations, we don't
Tell jokes. Yeah.
tell jokes about language and make them feel less than. That also has to be something that's addressed. Just as you address racial prejudice or anything like that, you also need to be talking about the linguistic prejudice that's happening, and that's not acceptable. So there needs to be some kind of open discussion around that as well. Because those little microaggressions, they add up. I got really tired in Denmark of being called charming in the middle of business meetings because I said something funny and, oh, there was a giggle and it was like, "We can change to English." "Oh, no, no, no. It's just your accent is so charming. It's so charming." It's like, you know what? If I was speaking English right now in a business setting, you would never call me charming. Okay. I
Yeah.
mean, I can bring out the charm when I want, but it's not right now in the middle of a business meeting. And that is not a compliment. And I know people mean the best with that. They don't mean to be
Yeah.
degrading. Yeah. That's not what they mean by it. They really mean to give me a compliment and say, "Oh no, your Danish is so great. It's so charming to listen to. We love listening to you." Da da da. But it's like, no, I want you to actually listen to me and my thoughts and my words, not my accent. And I don't want your attention because you think I'm charming. I want your attention because you believe what I bring to the table is worth listening to. And when you hear that day in and day out, it's just constantly telling you you're different, you're other, you don't belong, you're a foreigner, you'll never fit in, and you are being listened to for the wrong reasons. And that gets very draining and difficult over time.
Well, because 'cause you're trying to manage that, because you always have that in your head and your mind, no matter what you say, you're like,
Yeah.
every time, "Am I gonna speak up again, and they're just gonna call me charming?" You can't
Yeah.
really you're, like, filtering everything that you say. You're like, "Do I have the energy to listen to that conversation and contribute my ideas right now?" Like, because it's always both. You don't get to just have one.
It's exactly that.
which people experience in different cultures regardless. These are things that you're going to experience regardless of accent. Like sometimes it's just your gender or this color of your
Mhm.
skin or
Yep.
your
It's
height
everything.
or your body size.
Sexuality, ability. Yeah, everything.
And so when we are learning this with accents, and if this is a good place for us to start, it seems like a pretty almost a simple place that you can start where you can be there and putting that into practice and giving that dignity of somebody and that intention to somebody, the attention of what you have to say matters and I want to hear it can be one small thing towards opening and expanding our world and pushing us towards goals that we have about being someone who gives people dignity and respect and who does not discriminate and can bring people into a table, can create psychological safety, can bring people to confidence by doing something small and little. It seems small and little, but it's actually really big just listening to your
It
accent.
is. Yeah, and it leads to everything, as you bring up all those different areas of discrimination, when someone opens their mouth, you've already decided their gender, their sexuality. You can hear that. A lot of people believe they can hear that, right? Their race, their education, their socioeconomic status. There's so much that we put into the way someone speaks. So, yes, we love to believe we don't discriminate, we don't jump to conclusions, we don't have stereotypes or biases. But just think about it the next time you pick up the telephone and you call a doctor's office or wherever and you hear that person on the phone, I guarantee you've made a picture in your mind that says a lot about that person. And just be aware that that's happening because it is the foundation of a lot of discrimination that we see across the board.
And acknowledge, I think, too, that it's not easy. It is going to take effort because when you are trying to have a conversation who does speak a different original language or have a complete different accent, from a northerner to a southerner, you might use different, we said this earlier, slang, vernacular, different words for different things. My favorite is serviette versus napkin. You want to
Yes.
be
Yeah.
careful there with that one, but you're using different words for things and it takes work and it is hard work. But it is worth the effort too because it's so rewarding just like anything that you put hard work into. It's so rewarding when you can build a relationship, you can build that trust, you can build your company, you can build your story, you can experience so much more for yourself, and you're also bringing other people into something. So both of us are learning.
Yeah. And I think when you just mentioned that with serviette and napkin, you made me also think about as a speaker what you can do because we've been focused a little bit here on as a listener, right? And trying to understand. But we also need to remember what we're bringing to the table when we're in conversation with people from different places, different backgrounds, whatever it might be. And so also remembering things like keeping our vocabulary simple and clear, not trying to impress people with language that no one actually uses. And there are plenty of people who are very proud of their academic backgrounds, who define themselves by their great vocabularies. And it is something to be very proud of. But if you speak in a way that no one understands, then you're not really communicating. And that is not effective use of your vocabulary. So over the 20 years I've been abroad, I have significantly decreased my vocabulary simply because I haven't used those words because I know people won't understand me. And it doesn't help to show up and try to be dominant and impress everyone with my eloquence when they don't understand what I'm saying. We need
That
to get
just
a job done.
isolates. Yeah.
Yeah, it isolates people. And it's a way of using your power and privilege to keep other people in a lower position. And we don't spend enough time talking about the way we use language as a weapon. And we very much do that. So keeping our language simple, staying away from cultural analogies and idioms, sports related terminology. As Americans, we are so guilty of this, going out into the world and using sports terms, sports analogies. We have a lot of sports that are only played in America, remember? So we have to be really careful with the terminology we use. And what's funny is we often don't even realize it comes from sports, the whole 9 yards. That's football, American football. And touch base even is coming from baseball, touching base. And yet that's worked its way into business jargon all over the world. We do need to be aware of these things and how we are communicating, the language that we use, also the speed that we speak with. our own accents, the way that we drop all of our word endings, shoulda, woulda, coulda, and I'm gonna, and all of those ways of speaking that are fine over coffee with your friend at home, but do not work when you move into a global setting and you're in a remote work setting and you're online and you're speaking through microphones and there's static or connection issues. And we just really need to focus on clarity when it comes to our global communication. So, as speakers as well, even as the native speaker who thinks they own the language and everyone should understand me because I have no accent, we do. And we need to be aware of it when we enter conversations from a speaker perspective as well.
Oh, yeah. That's so important. And just thinking about those little words and phrases that we do use. And when you see that look of confusion on somebody's face,
Yes.
that it's okay to say, what did I do? Did I say something wrong? Did that come across
Mm-mm.
clearly? Oh, yeah, you might not know that phrase. And not like, oh, you might not know that phrase. You're such an idiot. But, oh, you might not know that phrase. Let me explain it to you. And because that might help you in another conversation. Like that also, it's okay to teach people, but as long as you're not coming up with a, I'm going to be your teacher all the time in every conversation we have with you, I'm trying to teach you. Nobody wants that. Like, come on,
Right.
nobody wants that. But it's
Yeah.
okay because then maybe you can go, "Oh, so how would you say that phrase?" Or "What's the word for this?" Our neighbors, a couple houses down, they speak Karen, and it has been so fun. We've gotten to know them. The pandemic kind of quit that because we never left our houses, but in the as we were getting to know each other, we would go, "Oh, so how do you say this word in your language?" And we might not know communications or like be able to have a full conversation, but it would be really fun. They'd get so excited when I would count to 5. They wanted to teach it to me, and then, like, I could help them with stuff, and they can help me, and we would, like, had this relationship of, like, bettering each other and learning and being curious, really being curious about each other, and they would bring me food, and we'd take them food, and it built a relationship, and even if it's not like a I'm not gonna tell you my deepest, darkest secrets, all my stories, it's still a really beautiful relationship, and that's the beauty of different cultures and different languages when you can open yourself up to that, you know?
Yeah. And I think you said the key word, which is curiosity, right? In every conversation, every relationship you enter, to be curious, openly curious about the other person, there to learn with the best intentions. And I don't think you can go wrong that way.
I agree. I agree. Well, I've got my 2 famous questions I wanna ask you, but before I do that, is there anything else you feel like would be important for our listeners to hear? We don't wanna miss anything.
Oh my gosh, this has been such a great conversation. I've so enjoyed it. This topic is enormous, right? But I think that we've touched on the most important bits of it. So I'm so happy you were interested in it and wanted to talk about this because it's
Of course.
really such an important topic.
It really is, and I'm so grateful that you're doing the work that you're doing because it's gonna be crucial. It has been crucial, but just as we're growing more into this remote economy, from global to remote, I guess, economy, I think the work that you're doing is really crucial, and this is a very, very valuable conversation. Before I ask how can we find you, I would love to hear my 2 questions from you, and I know you've got them on your sticky note there that you've been
Yes.
thinking about, but I would love to hear from you what it for you as a leader in your field or just as a global leader, what does integrity mean to you?
Yeah, and when you asked me that, told me that was what you were going to ask me, I thought that was such a good question because everyone says oh, integrity is so important, but nobody knows what it means. I'm so happy you have people defining this. For me, I think integrity means knowing how to make value based decisions. And the reason that's so complicated is that most people don't know their values. So people who say, oh, they value integrity. Well, I don't see integrity as a value in itself. Integrity is how you operate within your values. So do you know how to make decisions in your life based on the values you hold dear? And that means you must know what your values actually are. So that's how I would define that.
Oh, that's awesome. And I'm really glad you brought that up because I do hear this a lot. Well, integrity is our number one value. Like we put it in our mission statement. And this is
Yeah,
why I
it's
asked
in
this
every
question.
mission
It
statement.
is because nobody has I've gotten the same definition a couple of times, not the one you just gave me, but a couple of times people have given me the same definition. But I've asked this question to like almost 40 people now, and they've all been different. So that just tells me that I mean, this is true. We don't really understand what it means. So I love hearing that from you, that it's the way we act out our values. It's awesome. So my other question for you though is what does balance look like? I mean, you have written a book, you've done TED Talk, so you have a business, you have children, you have a global life because I think you still have family in the States, is
Yes,
that
yeah,
correct?
yeah.
And you
States
live in
and
Singapore
Denmark
and
and yeah, we have
we got
family
people all
all
over.
over.
So what does a balanced life look like to you?
This is such a hard question. And I was even speaking for a women's group yesterday, and a very similar question came up. And what I am landing on, I think finally, is balance is when you wake up happy in the morning. That's it. That's it. Because the world tells you what balance should be, right? Especially as women, that I need to be a good mom, I need to be a good wife, need to be a good sister, need to be a good daughter, need to be a good businesswoman, need to be a CEO, need to be a good author. I mean, oh my gosh. And I could chase all of those dreams it's exhausting, and I am exhausted. And I'm finally maybe getting close to coming to the realization that no one can define balance for me. And balance is going to be whatever makes me happy. And if I'm waking up happy in the morning, then I'm living a balanced life, because it means that I'm ticking all those boxes for myself. And in whatever that means for me, and it's going to be different for everyone. So I think that's the only way that I can answer that question at this stage, is if I can wake up happy every morning. And I'm not waking up happy every single morning. So I know I'm not there yet. I haven't figured it out, but I feel like maybe I'm getting there. I think this is a lifelong process of finding balance. And I think especially as women, we have an extra layer of difficulty with balance because the expectations for us are a little bit different. So I'm working on it.
You must be a morning person,
Definitely
because I
not.
have never once woken up happy in the morning.
I know.
Never once,
I'm,
ever.
I'm, I was a morning person before I had children. And, the minute you have kids, it's like, forget it. Anything before
Right.
9 o'clock just isn't going to function. So yeah,
Yeah,
working
I
on
mean,
it, working.
I would love that. That is literally said this to my husband last night, that this is the hardest thing in my life, is to wake up in the morning, and it's always been. And so maybe I need to get a coach on on how to do this.
Or maybe we can also reframe this though. We could say that you go to bed happy, right? I
There
mean,
we go.
I think either way, either you're waking up happy, excited about the day ahead because you have balance, or you're going to bed happy thinking that you've lived everything was the way it should be, right? That you found that
There we
balance in your
go.
day. So maybe it's going to bed happy. That's also fine, I think. I think it's the same idea.
Oh, I love it. I love it. And I hope that you do wake up happy in the mornings. I hope everybody does. And I hope that and pray that someday I will too. This is my life goal. Awesome. Heather, this has been such a joy talking to you. I know all your info is going to be in the show notes for our guests, and I'll tell everybody at the beginning, but how can we find you, and how can we get in touch with you, learn more about your work, and hire you to help us in our companies do this better?
Well, everything about me and my speaking and my books is at heatherhansen.com. And everything about my company and the training programs that we provide is at globalspeechacademy.com. But of course, I love the personal connection of LinkedIn, and I'm very active there. So I'm happy to connect with anyone who'd like to reach out there as well.
Awesome. Well, we'll make sure all those links are in our show notes for anybody who wants to check you out. Thank you again, Heather. This was so fun, and I can't wait to continue to get to know you and keep seeing how this changes our culture. So thank you for your work
Yeah,
and what you
thanks for
do.
having me. This was so much fun. Thanks so much, Kyla.
Thank you for joining me on this journey to grow in our leadership. If you enjoyed this episode, you've got to check out the leadership and self-care coaching programs on my website at kylakofer.com. Let's change the world together.